I thought working nights at an art museum would be boring, until a sculpture spoke to me and I stumbled into a hidden room full of forbidden artifacts. These stories are weird, hilarious, and just a little creepy, and they're all true. I never thought I'd land a job at the Rothberg Museum of Fine Art. It was one of those names whispered in the same breath as the Louvre or the Met, an old, ivy-cloaked structure nestled in the heart of the city, steeped in prestige and mystery. It was beautiful, certainly. Regal staircases, hushed galleries, marble that glowed under dim security lights like bone-polished clean. The night shift paid well, and I needed the money. Simple as that. I imagined myself sitting in a comfortable chair, sipping coffee while masterpieces watched me from their golden frames. Maybe I'd read a book or do a crossword. Night work is supposed to be quiet, right? That illusion shattered on my third night, the moment a sculpture whispered to me. But I'll get to that. The first 2 nights were uneventful, if you ignored the creeping sensation of being watched. Even with security cameras lining every hallway and motion sensors in every room, the place felt too still, too sentient. The museum closed to the public at 6 p.m. sharp, and by 7:30, it was just me, a clunky radio, and my flashlight. The building was a labyrinth of gallery wings and subterranean archives. The public only ever saw maybe 40% of what was housed there. The rest? Storage rooms, restoration labs, locked wings with doors sealed decades ago. The walls held more than paintings. They held secrets. That third night, I was making my rounds in the European Classical Hall, a long corridor of stone statues, mostly Greco-Roman. You've seen pictures. Limestone gods and goddesses staring blankly into forever frozen mid-myth. The temperature in that gallery was always colder than the rest of the museum, and the HVAC logs confirmed it had no reason to be. As I passed the statue of Eurydice, carved mid-flea, eyes wide in silent agony, I heard it, a whisper, not from my radio. Not from the echoing hallway, from inside my head. Turn around. It wasn't a voice exactly, more like an urgent thought shoved into my mind with someone else's fingers. I froze. My flashlight beam trembled as I slowly turned. Behind me stood the statue of Orpheus, Eurydice's tragic lover. But here's the thing. He wasn't supposed to be behind me. Orpheus had been positioned on the opposite end of the corridor, a solid 20 paces back. Now he was directly behind where I'd been walking. I hadn't heard the scraping of stone, no footfalls, no mechanical winch, just silence and a whisper. I laughed nervously and muttered to myself, "Getting jumpy. Don't be stupid." But I kept looking over my shoulder as I left the gallery, and Orpheus was no longer where he'd started. My logbook entry for that hour was one lonely sentence. Sculpture appears to have moved. I didn't mention the voice. The next night, I brought coffee, 2 extra flashlights, and a portable speaker to play soft jazz. Sound helped anchor me. Without it, the silence had a way of growing claws and crawling into your thoughts. I avoided the sculpture corridor until the end of my shift. But fate, or something deeper, had other plans. While checking a fuse box in the North Egyptian wing, I accidentally pushed against a blank patch of wall. There was a subtle click, like a latch undone. The wall groaned inward with a soft exhale of air. A hidden door. I stared at it, stunned. No record of secret passageways had been in the training manual. No alert had ever pinged on the cameras. I hesitated, flashlight shaking in my hand. Curiosity clawed at me harder than fear. Inside was a narrow, spiraling staircase. Dust hung in the air like ancient breath. The steps were stone, slightly curved, and slick with moisture. I should have called my supervisor. I should have radioed someone. Instead, I descended. The passage ended in a small, circular chamber lit by a single bare bulb swinging overhead. A buzzing sound filled the space, like distant flies trapped in amber. The room held artifacts, but not the kind found behind glass cases. There were masks, tribal, ceremonial, their surfaces cracked with age and coated in something dark. A framed tapestry depicting a starless sky and writhing, faceless figures. Shelves of jars labeled in Latin, some filled with swirling liquid and others with dust. At the center of the room stood a sculpture unlike anything I'd seen in the museum's collection. It was modern, maybe postmodern, but grotesque. A writhing amalgam of limbs, mouths, and eyeless faces carved from black marble. It pulsed. It pulsed. My stomach churned. I stepped closer. Another whisper, clearer this time. You shouldn't be here. I backed away, hitting the shelf behind me. One of the jars fell, shattering on the floor. Smoke, no mist, poured out, curling around my legs. My radio crackled violently, and a voice, not mine, came through. Reseal the chamber. Now. I scrambled up the stairs, slammed the hidden door shut, and waited, heart hammering. It took me 5 minutes to gather the courage to breathe again. I marked the wall with a pencil stub from my pocket, made a vague note in the incident log about electrical interference, and pretended that none of it had happened. But the dreams started that same night. They were always about the statue, the pulsing one. In my dreams, it spoke in riddles. It shifted shapes. It asked me questions I couldn't answer, showed me visions of hollow-eyed curators and walls bleeding color. When I woke, I felt something watching from the shadows of my room. I thought maybe I was unraveling. Maybe the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. Until I mentioned it to Susan, the day shift receptionist, the only person I semi-trusted. Her face went pale. You heard it too? She whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. They don't tell new hires about the foundry room, she said. That's what you found. That statue, they call it the nest. No one knows where it came from. One of the curators brought it in during the 1940s, and a week later, he gouged out his own eyes with a letter opener. I laughed. I shouldn't have, but I did. Come on. That's a story to scare rookies. But she didn't smile. They used to keep it in the East Wing. Visitors complain about nosebleeds. Night staff kept quitting. After someone had a seizure in front of it, they sealed it away. They think it manipulates thoughts, draws people in. I didn't sleep that day. The next night, I wore a crucifix I hadn't touched since childhood and avoided the Egyptian wing altogether. My rounds were silent. Too silent. Even the jazz couldn't push back the weight of the atmosphere pressing in on me. That's when I noticed the statues again. Orpheus and Eurydice were both gone from their usual spots. Not moved to storage. Not relocated for conservation. Gone. In their place stood something else, something I hadn't seen cataloged in any collection. A stone bust with too many eyes. They weren't carved. They were real, glassy, wet. They blinked. I ran. Back in the control room, I locked the door and stared at the monitors. Gallery after gallery was empty, until they weren't. In the corner of Gallery B17, the monitors fuzzed and flickered. For a second, just 1 second, I saw the black marble statue, the one from the hidden room, standing right in the center of the gallery, breathing like it was alive. Then the screen cut to static. I called my supervisor. I told him there was a breach, that something had entered from the outside. He showed up 40 minutes later. We walked every gallery. Nothing was out of place. The sculpture was gone. Orpheus and Eurydice were back where they belonged. The bust with blinking eyes didn't exist. He looked at me, unamused. You sure you're not sleepwalking? But he said it with a tremor, like he'd had similar nights. I'm not sure what's happening here. I don't know why the rules are what they are. Why some nights the paintings seem to shift slightly in their frames, or why some sculptures hum when the lights go off. But I know this. The museum is alive, and it's watching, and the statue in the hidden room. I think it wants out. I started keeping 2 logbooks, one official and one secret. The official one lived in the security office, a beige binder filled with hourly check-ins, HVAC readings, and dull notes about visitor access points. The other was a leather-bound notebook I kept hidden in my locker. That one had the real stories, the whispers, the flickering monitors, the way the shadows in the West Gallery sometimes stretched against the grain of light. I couldn't explain what I was dealing with, and I knew better than to tell HR. The museum didn't want answers. It wanted silence. There's something they don't tell you during training. The job isn't about keeping people out. It's about keeping things in. The Rothbard Museum isn't just a collection of beautiful art. It's a vault, a cage, and some nights, the locks groan like they're tired of holding back the monsters. Every shift began the same. I scanned my ID at the side entrance, passed through 2 security gates, and made my way to the security hub buried beneath the north wing. From there, I'd check the camera feeds and take the night's assignment sheet. A rotation through 10 galleries, 2 mechanical rooms, and the storage vaults. But there were always extras. An hour into my shift one Tuesday, I got a call from the maintenance wing. Leo, the building engineer, wanted me to check the ventilation corridor near Gallery K, 12. Temperatures rising for no reason, he said. Sensors are fine. Just give it a look. I made my way there, clipboard in hand, expecting a jammed fan or a leaking duct. What I found was something entirely different. The air was heavy and wet, like the inside of a sleeping animal's mouth. The corridor stank of iron and mold, and the walls, the condensation on them didn't drip. It slithered. I could have sworn I saw streaks forming symbols, circles crossed by jagged lines, like runes carved in steam. I reached the fan housing and nearly dropped my flashlight. Inside, caught in the turning blades, was a face. Not a real one, thank God, but a sculpted mask made of what looked like wax and bone, wedged deep in the rotating fins. It wasn't there before. I checked that corridor every week. I called Leo again. Don't touch it, he said too quickly. Just mark the blockage. I'll send art preservation. They'll take care of it. Art preservation? For a ventilation issue? But Leo hung up before I could ask more. That's how it went. The longer I worked there, the more I realized my duties were a blend of janitor, priest, and jailer. One night, I had to reseal the old service elevator with a strip of red tape. Another, I had to place mirrors around a 15th century painting that made interns cry without knowing why. The mirrors didn't reflect the painting. They reflected something else, a dark hallway that didn't exist in the Real Museum. They called it resonant containment. That's what they put in the paperwork when you found something too weird for maintenance, too old for conservation, and too real to ignore. The rules became less about protocol and more like incantations. No humming near Gallery D. No flashlight beams directly on the Renaissance altarpiece. Never speak aloud the Latin carved on the base of the masked dancer statue. I broke one of those rules by accident, twice. The first was the flashlight rule. I was doing rounds during a scheduled power test. The lights blinked out just as I passed the Italian Renaissance room. I didn't think, it was pure instinct. I pointed my beam at the altarpiece. The flashlight died instantly. Not fizzled, not dimmed. Died. Batteries full, bulb intact, but gone. I clicked it over and over until a pale glow filled the room. Not from my light. From the altar. A figure stood behind it. Gaunt. Rotted. Draped in black silk that fluttered despite the dead air. I turned and ran. When I checked the cameras later, the footage skipped the entire moment. 4 minutes of black screen before resuming with me bolting from the room. The second mistake was the Latin inscription. There's a statue in Gallery N, mid-sized, abstract, unsettling. It depicts a dancer in motion, draped in a metallic shawl that never rusts. On the base is an inscription, Que saltat in tenebris, Manet in aeternum. I muttered it once during a slow shift, trying to stay awake. It echoed in my head like a bell underwater. That night, I couldn't stop hearing music. Low, plucked strings and soft drums. It followed me into every room, into the hallways, even into the restroom. Always behind me, never ahead. When I returned to the statue later, the position of the dancer had changed. The arms were wider, like an invitation. The shawl hung lower, and the inscription was gone. The museum has rules. It needs them. I began to understand why some of the senior guards wore strange amulets beneath their uniforms or refused to enter certain wings after midnight. This place runs on more than just electricity and bureaucracy. It runs on ritual, routine, and fear. Then came the door. There's a small hallway behind the South American Gallery that's used mostly for emergency exits and equipment storage. At the end of that hallway is a door marked, "Do not enter, staff only." I'd walked past it 100 times. But one night, around 2:15 a.m., the door was open, just slightly. I radioed it in. No one responded. I stepped closer. Cold air seeped from the crack like dry ice. Inside, I found an impossibility. It was a mirror of the museum. Not physically, a perfect copy, but emotionally. The same galleries, the same sculptures, only wrong. The paintings were smeared, the statues weeping black paint from empty eyes. The air vibrated with dissonant humming, like a cello string pulled too tight. And hanging above the archway of this mirror museum was the marble sculpture I'd found in the hidden room, the nest. It was bigger, moving. A low, guttural sound echoed from it like a mother cooing over something just hatched. I stepped backward. The door began to close on its own. A voice whispered in my head again, familiar now. "You belong here." I slammed the door shut and marked it with duct tape in the shape of a cross. It hasn't opened since, but now I check it twice a night. I have to, because sometimes I see footprints in the dust leading up to it. Barefoot prints, child-sized, and they never lead away. People think museum guards have it easy, a quiet gig surrounded by beauty, but they don't see the other side. They don't see the duties that defy explanation, the ones you don't write down because no one would believe them. I once found a second shadow trailing me down the corridor. Not mine. Too tall. Too slow. I once saw a painting bleed colors it didn't contain. I once heard a little girl laughing behind a sealed glass case. No child has ever been inside the museum after hours. The Rothberg Museum is not a place you guard. It's a place you survive. Every night is a test of nerves, willpower, and obedience. Because the moment you stop respecting the rules, the real ones, you're no longer the guard. You're the exhibit. Some rules are written, others are whispered, but the ones that keep you alive, those are learned the hard way. When I started, they gave me a laminated card with the standard protocols: hourly rounds, check camera feeds, log temperature readings, report anomalies. It all sounded reasonable. But after that third week, a senior guard named Don slipped me a different list, handwritten, faded ink, and full of instructions that didn't make sense at the time. No humming. No touching the paintings after midnight. Always nod at the woman in the red dress, even if you're alone. Don't say your name out loud in the Asian ceramics room. Never open gallery R after 2:44 a.m. Wear felt-soled shoes on Thursdays. I asked Don if he was joking. He just looked at me with tired eyes and said, "There's a reason I've lasted 6 years on night shift. Follow the list." At first, I laughed it off. Then Thursday rolled around. The day had started normally. Power tests in the East Wing. HVAC tweaks in the lower vaults. I wore my usual sneakers, not felt-soled, and didn't think twice. Around 3 a.m., I began hearing something odd in Gallery L. Not voices. Footsteps, but not human ones. It was more like a soft, dragging sound, like fabric sweeping across tile. I turned the corner and froze. The sculptures in the room, 12 marble pieces from a 17th century Spanish collection, were no longer on their pedestals. They had shifted, just slightly. All of them now faced the doorway, heads tilted downward, hands raised like they were in mourning or anticipation. One statue, a figure called La Madre Silenciosa, the Silent Mother, was now missing its veil. It had always been sculpted wearing a long, face-covering drape, carved delicately from stone. Now the veil was gone, and beneath it, the face wasn't carved. It was real, pale flesh, closed eyes, lips that twitched slightly when I approached. I stumbled back, trying to keep my flashlight steady. A long smear of red stretched from the pedestal to the center of the room, as if something had been dragged. Then I remembered the list: wear felt-soled shoes on Thursdays. My sneakers squeaked on the floor as I turned to run. A whisper rippled through the gallery like wind through leaves. "She hears you." That night, I burned the laminated card and memorized Don's list instead. I learned the museum's rules weren't arbitrary. They were warnings disguised as quirks. No humming. I broke that one the following Monday while doing rounds in the medieval gallery. I just passed a wall of Flemish tapestries and was softly humming to keep myself awake. The room suddenly grew colder, like someone had opened a freezer. A suit of armor at the far end, a ceremonial piece with a long halberd and no historical record, turned its head. I didn't see it move. 1 second it was still. The next, it was staring directly at me. The humming died in my throat. I slowly backed out, refusing to break eye contact. The armor's visor trembled slightly, as if something inside was breathing. Once I was clear, I locked the gallery door and added 3 layers of duct tape. Maintenance later said the armor hadn't moved an inch. They didn't check the video footage. It had gone black at the exact moment I started humming. Some rules seemed laughable until they weren't. Always nod at the woman in the red dress. I didn't see her until my 4th week. It was around 1 a.m. I just finished my rounds in the French Impressionism Hall and was heading toward the break room when I saw her standing near the Monet. Red velvet dress, black gloves, pale, powdery skin, no ID badge. Visitors were long gone. I knew every staff member on shift. She wasn't one of them. I froze. My gut screamed that something was wrong. But before I could ask who she was, she smiled, tilted her head, and started walking, soundlessly, toward me. My hand reached instinctively for the radio, but then I remembered the list. Always nod at the woman in the red dress, even if you're alone. I gave her the slightest nod. Her steps halted. She smiled wider, then turned and walked through the nearest gallery door, which led to a sealed exhibit undergoing restoration. When I checked the cameras later, they didn't show her. Just me, standing and nodding at empty air. Some nights, I wondered who wrote the rules in the first place. Don didn't know. Neither did Leo. When I pressed Susan about it, she looked away and whispered, "They're not new. We just keep passing them down." But the rule that terrified me the most was this one. Never open gallery hour after 2:44 a.m. Gallery hour had been sealed off for over a decade. It housed artifact from an obscure European cult that worshipped a god called the Hollowing One. The art was grotesque, sculptures made from bone, tapestries stitched with hair. It had been part of a temporary exhibit in the early 2000s before too many accidents forced the museum to close the wing. People claimed the room breathed. That time inside it stretched. There was no key, just a magnetic seal tied to the main security console. I'd passed that door dozens of times during rounds and never gave it a second thought. Until one night, 2:43 a.m., I saw the light above the door turn green. Unlocked. I stared at it, then at my watch. 2:44. The air behind me shifted, like something had just stepped up too close. I didn't turn around. I knew better. Instead, I whispered out loud. Rule number 6. Never open gallery hour after 2:44 a.m. The green light snapped back to red. The door clicked. The presence vanished. I stood there, shaking for a long time. I didn't finish my rounds that night. I sat in the break room, listening to the sound of footsteps echoing through galleries I knew were empty. The rules don't protect the art. They protect you. They aren't guidelines. They're survival tactics. Every one of them was written in blood and fear, and if you break them, you pay. I've seen what happens when people forget. There was a guy named Felix who joined the team a month ago. Young, cocky, didn't believe in superstition. He made fun of this silly rule list and said ghosts were just poor ventilation and sleep deprivation. His third shift, he whistled inside gallery. A clear violation. They found him 3 hours later in front of a sculpture of Saint Sebastian, whispering prayers in Latin, eyes wide and weeping. He didn't know his name. He didn't remember who he was. He just kept repeating, "The arrows never stop. They never stop." He hasn't been back since. The rules are strange. Some are even hilarious on paper, but they are sacred. Break them, and the museum doesn't forgive. It's like the building is watching, listening, waiting for someone to misstep, and each rule you break peels away a layer of protection, like removing one brick at a time from a dam holding back something ancient and hungry. That laminated card they gave me on day one, it meant nothing. But Don's list, the scribbled warnings, the whispered mantras, the superstition disguised as safety, that list is the only reason I'm still breathing. And I fear the day I forget even one line. Because lately, the museum feels different. The lights flicker more often. The paintings seem to shift when I'm not looking. And the nest, it hasn't been in the hidden room for 3 nights now. There's something no one tells you about art museums. Not when you're a visitor, strolling past oil paintings with a coffee in hand, or even when you're new on the job, fresh off orientation. It's this. Not all the art is dead. Some of it breathes. Some of it waits. Some of it remembers. By my 6th week at the Rothberg Museum, I'd memorized every twist and turn of the floor plan. But there were still places I hadn't explored, rooms hidden behind sealed doors, staircases that didn't show up on the blueprints. I'd been avoiding the foundry room, the chamber where I first saw the nest. But after 3 consecutive shifts without seeing the statue anywhere, my fear turned into a gnawing need to know where it had gone. That thing haunted my sleep. I'd wake up drenched in sweat with the image of mouths pressed into marble, dozens of them muttering in unison. My walls would breathe at night. My dreams smelled like oil paint and rotting roses. I had to go back. The pencil mark I'd made near the hidden door in the Egyptian wing was still there, faint but visible. I pressed against the same section of wall, felt the click, and the stone swung open again. But the stairs were different this time. Longer. The first time I descended, there had been maybe a dozen steps. Now there were at least 30, spiraling downward into something far colder than a storage basement. When I reached the bottom, I stopped dead. The foundry room wasn't a room anymore. It was a gallery, a massive underground vault carved from black stone. Spotlights flickered on as I entered, illuminating artwork I had never seen before, sculptures twisted into impossible shapes, canvases that rippled gently despite no airflow. Each piece was unmarked, unlabeled, and worse, uniged. No dust, no cracking varnish, as if they'd just been created. I stepped toward the nearest painting. It was large, nearly 10 feet tall, and framed in what looked like animal bone. The image showed a field under a night sky with stars arranged in unfamiliar constellations. In the distance, shapes loomed, tall and faceless, half buried in soil. The paint shimmered strangely, like a layer of oil floating on water. My breath caught in my throat when I realized the grass in the field was swaying in real time. I blinked. The breeze in the painting stirred the branches of distant trees. One of the tall shapes turned its head. That's when I noticed a plaque carved directly into the wall beside it. Dreamscape number 4. Donated anonymously. 1952. I backed away. In the center of the chamber, where the nest had once stood, was now a pedestal holding nothing. No sculpture, just an impression in the dust where its weight had once pressed down. A dragged trail stretched away from it, grooves in the floor, as though something massive had slithered away on stone limbs. I followed the trail. It led to a small doorway near the far wall, partially obscured by a tapestry. I moved the fabric aside, and the moment I stepped through, my radio let out a shriek of static. Then a voice. You shouldn't be down here. Not Dawn. Not Susan. Not anyone I knew. Just a whisper soaked in venom and dust. I turned off the radio. I didn't want to hear more. The room beyond was lined with forbidden artifacts, items the public never got to see because they weren't meant to be seen. A book bound in human skin lay open on a table made of rusted iron. Portraits with blank eyes lined the walls, and in the center was a sculpture I can only describe as a looping Ouroboros made of human arms, limbs woven into a perfect circle, grasping at each other eternally. These weren't donations. These weren't acquisitions. These were offerings. And then I saw it. In the far right corner, hunched like a spider on its pedestal, was the nest. It had changed. Its surface rippled now. The limbs no longer appeared frozen, but pliable, like they were merely resting. Dozens of eyeless faces seemed to breathe in unison, and from within its core came the rhythmic sound of a heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. I stood there, hypnotized, until something touched my arm. I whirled around. No one was there, but on my sleeve was a smear of black paint. Fresh. The nest had reached for me. I stumbled back, flashlight trembling, and sprinted out of the room. I didn't stop until I was back in the main corridor, heart thundering in my chest. But when I reached the gallery staircase, it was gone. The wall had closed behind me. I was alone again, or I hoped I was. That night, I found Don in the break room, sipping stale coffee and chain-smoking beside an open window. His eyes were darker than I remembered, deeper set, like something inside him was trying to claw its way out. I saw the nest. I told him quietly. He didn't flinch, just looked at me and said, "Where was it?" I explained about the extended staircase, the breathing painting, the offerings. He didn't seem surprised. "They've opened the deep collection," he muttered. "That's bad." "Who's that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he said, "The nest doesn't just live in the museum. It is the museum. It's the center of whatever this place is now. You think you're walking through galleries, but you're just moving through its memory. And the more you see, the more it sees you." He leaned forward. "Tell me something, kid. Since you touched that wall, since you found that hidden room, have you ever left the museum?" I opened my mouth to say yes, but then I hesitated, because the truth was, I wasn't sure. I remembered going home. I remembered showers, frozen meals, episodes of TV playing while I fell asleep. But I didn't remember the commute. I didn't remember my neighbors. I didn't remember ever seeing sunlight. Don saw the realization hit me. He nodded grimly. "I haven't been outside in 9 years. And if I have, I don't remember it." I left the break room in a daze, wandered into the East Gallery, and found myself staring at a painting I'd passed 100 times. Only now it was different. The landscape had changed. A new figure had been added. Me, standing in a hallway, flashlight in hand, eyes wide with fear. I pressed my hand against the glass. It was still wet. That's when I understood the final truth. The museum doesn't just collect art. It creates it. And I was being sculpted, painted, etched into its halls, not as a guard, but as a subject. Every night I patrolled its corridors, it studied me. Every rule I followed or broke, it adapted. Every whisper I ignored, it recorded. It had my scent now, my reflection, my voice, and maybe soon my soul. I started walking again, heart pounding, determined to find Susan, to see if she remembered her life outside this place, to find proof that I was still real. But as I passed through the Victorian wing, I heard a new sound. Hammering. Not mechanical. Not restoration work. Chiseling. Someone was sculpting. And when I turned the corner, I saw a slab of marble with my face slowly emerging from the stone, eyes closed, mouth slightly agape. The artist. The nest. It was sculpting me by hand, dozens of hands, and every chisel strike matched the beat of my heart. I ran, past the newly carved bust of my own face, past the echoing hammer strikes that matched the tempo of my heartbeat, past the empty-eyed portraits that tracked my every step. My boots clapped on a marble like gunshots, but the museum's breath muffled everything else. It was awake now, fully awake, and I could feel it following me, not with footsteps, but with intent. Somewhere behind me, the nest was sculpting, not as my face, my fate. The Rothbard Museum no longer felt like a building. It was a living organism, shifting its anatomy to trap me in a maze of whispers, brushstrokes, and stone. The hallways were changing. Paintings I had walked by 100 times no longer hung in the same places. Statues turned their heads in real time. The emergency exit I tried to reach simply wasn't there anymore. Panic spiraled into fury. I slammed my fist against the wall beside the East Conservatory. "I'm not your exhibit," I screamed. "You don't get to keep me." But the museum didn't answer in words. It answered with memories. As I turned into the atrium, I saw my apartment, recreated in perfect detail within one of the display rooms. My worn couch, the tiny kitchen, my half-drunk mug of tea. But it was made of canvas and sculpted air, lit by an unseen spotlight like it was part of the everyday life in the 21st century exhibit. On the wall above it hung a plaque. Untitled, security guard, night shift, mixed media, memory, regret, isolation. Acquired 2025. That's when I understood. I hadn't been going home after my shifts. I hadn't been living a life outside these walls. The museum had taken me piece by piece, night after night. My memories, my voice, my routines. It had cataloged and copied everything, building a version of me that was easier to keep. The real me was dissolving. Unless I stopped it. I needed help. Real help. Not Don. He was too far gone. Not Susan. She hadn't shown up for her shift in 3 nights, and I hadn't seen her on any cameras since. I had one option left. Leo. I headed for the maintenance wing, one of the few places the museum didn't seem to control completely. Leo had been there for decades, maybe longer. If anyone knew how to fight back, it was him. I found him in the sub-basement, hunched over blueprints under a flickering fluorescent light. He didn't look surprised when I barged in, out of breath and pale. "You found the deep collection," he said without looking up. "You knew." Leo finally raised his eyes. "Everyone who stays past their second month knows. But most of us choose ignorance. It's safer." I slammed my hand on the desk. "It's sculpting me. It's putting me into an exhibit." He nodded. "That's what it does. It collects people who break the rules, or get too curious, or simply resonate with the wrong piece. You're attuned now. You're not guarding the museum anymore. You're becoming part of it. Then tell me how to stop it." He sighed and reached into a locked drawer, pulling out a weathered leather folder. Inside was a sketch, charcoal on vellum, of the nest. This was drawn in 1943, before the Rothbard opened, back when it was still a private collection. He flipped to another page. A photograph, grainy and yellowing, showed the same sculpture, but it was standing in the background of an entirely different museum. In France, wherever it goes, it makes a home. Then it makes the walls. Then it makes the rules. I stared at the photograph. "So we destroy it." Leo looked at me like I was mad. "You can't destroy the nest. You feed it or you escape." "But how?" He turned to a final page. It was a list, not of rules, but of names. Former guards, curators, night janitors. Their last known locations were all the same, unknown, except for one. The bottom name had a note beside it. Attempted extraction, failed. Now part of Exhibit 119. That name was mine, but it was dated 2 weeks ago. I was already gone. I stared at Leo, the weight of realization dragging my lungs into my stomach. "Then what am I?" He didn't answer, and then the lights went out. Total darkness swallowed the basement. My radio shrieked again, louder this time, and the static coalesced into 100 whispers, all layered over one another. "Stay still. Frame him. Chisel in. You belong here." The air tightened. I turned toward Leo, but he was gone. No chair, No desk, just a pool of wet footprints leading into the wall. The museum was claiming him too. I bolted, not toward the galleries, but down, past the sub-basement, past the locked archives, into a tunnel that hadn't existed the night before. The air grew colder with every step, until my breath came out in crystal clouds. Eventually, I reached a door made of black wood, etched with carvings of closed eyes and stitched mouths. It was the final room. Behind it, I found a nest, now the size of a small car, sitting in a sunken pit like an altar. It had grown. The limbs writhed. The mouth sang. Faces contorted into parodies of those I had known. Dawn, Susan, even Leo, trapped in an endless sculpture of agony and worship. It was birthing art. The museum hadn't been curating these pieces. It had been making them, birthing them through suffering, obsession, and sacrifice. I stepped toward it. One of the hands reached up. My hand, I realized. It was perfect, down to the scar on my knuckle. It beckoned, and for a moment, I almost stepped in, but something stopped me. A painting, hanging crooked on a broken wall behind the pit, was a canvas. Abstract, furious. It showed a figure standing alone against a sea of darkness, one match lit in their hand. The plaque beneath it read, "Untitled, Last Resistance, Oil, Blood, Bone Dust, in Progress." It wasn't finished. That was my chance. I pulled the emergency flare from my belt, standard issue for fires and blackouts. I had never used it before. I struck it. Light flooded the chamber, red and violent. The nest recoiled. Its marble burned. The faces screamed in unison, not from pain, but from denial. It hadn't finished me yet. The sculpture cracked. Its limbs writhed violently, stone fingers melting like wax in the flare's heat. I screamed with it, tossing the flare directly into its chest. The explosion of light seared my retinas, and I staggered back, everything dissolving into sound and heat. Then nothing. I woke up in the museum's front garden. Sunlight. Real sunlight. People milled around, sipping lattes, reading brochures. Tourists. Normalcy. I stood, dazed, and stumbled toward the main entrance. Everything looked ordinary. The Rothbard Museum of Fine Art gleamed beneath the morning sun, its facade majestic and harmless. But when I reached the main doors, something stopped me. In a glass, I saw my reflection. Except it didn't move when I did. It smiled back. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I don't know what's still in there. I don't know if the nest truly died, or if it simply receded to rebuild, to resume its curation. But I do know this. Art is eternal, and some museums don't display masterpieces. They make them. So if you ever visit the Rothbard Museum, and you see a new exhibit in the West Hall titled The Night Watch, a sculpture of a man in a security uniform, frozen mid-scream, don't stare too long. Because sometimes, when you look at art, it looks back. The end